Having human conversations.
Hello, welcome to episode 2 for season 2. We have a wonderful guest with us today. This is Melanie and Chelze. And our wonderful guest today is Sahar Martinez. And today we're going to be talking about postpartum depression and the many things that go into that, and kind of getting more understanding of what that's like for people, and how that can have serious life-changing impacts for people. So why don't we start? Hello, Sahar.
Hi, Sahar.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you for being here, for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So I always like to start off with just kind of a definition for things, because I feel like knowledge is the best gift you can give to people. So when we think about what postpartum is, I wonder if you can give us kind of a definition of kind of what you think, how you see it and what you see it as.
Yeah. So postpartum depression, I think by definition, traditionally is depression that happens after pregnancy. And the way that we kind of presently look at it is more in a perinatal state. So what that means is that it's depression that can occur during pregnancy or after pregnancy. And it's really similar to the feelings of typical depression. So you have feelings of anger or irritability, a disturbance in sleep or appetite, crying or sadness. You have feelings of guilt or shame or hopelessness, a loss in the things that you found joy in before. And I think the thing that sets it apart from typical depression is that there are also thoughts of maybe harming yourself or the baby, and a lack of interest in the baby that can happen with postpartum depression.
Do you feel like women get talked to about the possibility of this happening when they're first going to doctor's appointments to get care when they find out that they're pregnant?
No, it doesn't. It's not, it's this like, and in a lot of ways, and maybe part of this is I reflect part of this in my own experience of having a baby, like having children, is that this is not talked about. It's not talked about in pregnancy. It's not talked about really after you have the baby. There is a very basic screening that happens for it, but it's not in pregnancy, you learn a lot about like the physical things to look for, right? Like, if you notice swelling, call us. If you notice bleeding, call us. But we don't really talk about the emotional toll or experience that pregnancy takes on us and takes on like the family system as a whole. And so it's not addressed in the way that I wish that it were.
And there's so much shame that happens when these emotions come up during that time, because you're still in such a vulnerable place, just having given birth and all of those things. So it's so interesting that that's not a part of the care,
Right. I think we're socialized to experience pregnancy and motherhood and parenthood in a specific way by the way that we experience what that looks like in the media and in our own families and the people around us and social media and all this stuff. It's supposed to be this really joyous occasion that, I used to always joke, like before I had my own kids, I imagined myself being like barefoot, holding a baby in one arm, like beautifully breastfeeding, looking perfect. And what was the reality of it was that I had postpartum depression. I was sweaty all the time. I didn't shower for days on end, and it was hard. I was barefoot, but it's probably because I couldn't even function putting my shoes on in that moment, not because I wanted to have this beautiful moment.
And then there's also like the lead up of what your story will be, right? I know it's kind of moving into a different space now with seeing other people, and when they write over Instagram or just listening into other people's experiences, it's really interesting. And I'm glad that it is moving in a different direction too, because it gives us more room to be able to have our own story.
Yeah, I think as a whole, there's so much shame around mental health. And then when we take it into the space of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, because there is this pressure to be the perfect mom, that perfect mom, for a lot of people, doesn't coexist in the same space as also struggling through parts of parenthood.
Yeah. For postpartum, how long does it normally last for individuals who are experiencing it?
So it depends. If it is diagnosed and actually treated, it's typically within like a year. It's 12 months. It can last up to 12 months. But if it goes undiagnosed, it can last much longer than that. What the research shows that if you're still experiencing symptoms of depression, postpartum depression after a year, that they move the diagnosis into just a general like major depressive disorder or like a different diagnosis. But that's if it gets treated. And so what we're looking at is that because of the stigma around perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, because of the lack of diagnosis that happens, that women are continuing to experience these symptoms sometimes years after having their babies.
So is this common? So is this like somebody could never have had depression in their life and then they got pregnant and then they could have essentially depression the rest of their life?
I mean, yeah, they could. They could. I mean, there are, if you have a diagnosis of depression or if you have experienced depression or anxiety prior to having kids, it puts you at a higher level of risk for having postpartum depression, or it becomes an I don't want to say risk, but it becomes an indicator for postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety or a perinatal mood and anxiety disorder. If you have a previous mental health issue. And if you don't have one and you start to experience postpartum depressive symptoms, those symptoms can be ongoing if they're not treated, in the same way that if you start experiencing depression or anxiety in your life, those symptoms can also be ongoing.
Right. How, now considering culture and how, different cultures view, first of all, mental health differently, but specifically around maybe roles of mothers and birthing and that process, I'm just curious about, do you feel like, how does it look in other cultures? Do they acknowledge postpartum in other cultures? Kind of, maybe speaking from your own culture, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that there are a lot of factors that go into that. And a lot of this, I think, goes back to when we live in a westernized culture and we use westernized medicine, there is a lack of context of what it is like for people from other cultures to experience the things like postpartum depression. I know in my own experience, when I had a very hard time talking about my postpartum depression in the beginning because when I tried to talk about it, it was the people around me, my Persian community around me tried to normalize the experience in a way of, oh, you're just tired. It's just tiredness. Once you get some rest, you'll feel better. Or, oh, you have 2 kids under 2. This is just what this is like. It will get better. Instead of holding the space to say, well, what is it that you're experiencing and how can we help? So I think that happens in a lot of cultures, that because there is a lack of understanding and there is so much stigma around mental health, and there's so much stigma around being perceived as not being a quote unquote good mother.
So the expectations for mothers is quite high.
Right.
And even culturally, there's different expectations for mothers, but generally they always seem to be pretty high. In my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, so like if we look at, like, I come from a collectivistic culture. And so when we look at collectivistic cultures, like Middle Eastern cultures, Latinx cultures, Asian cultures, there is this idea that the primary caregiver is the one that's supposed to be responsible for the well-being of the child, right? And most typically, the caregiver is thought to be the birthing person, the woman. And so that's a lot of pressure on a person to say, oh, okay, so you've lived this whole life before you had kids, and now you're having kids. And so that whole life that you lived, that has to all be put aside. And so your focus is solely on the well-being of your child, attending to your child's needs, and that's it. And so that's a big weight to carry, even if you have the best experience postpartum. When you factor in that you might need additional support because you are experiencing a perinatal mood and anxiety disorder, to also have to carry that, it feels impossible.
Yeah. And well, I mean, a lot of cultures also kind of look at from the Latinx community, because I'm part of that community, I feel like if you have the privilege of having extended family to also partake in child rearing, they usually do. Like there's a grandma involved, usually if it's around, there's, you know, maybe sisters or aunts or something who help also. And then recognize that new mother does maybe need that help, but it's usually, there's a sense of like, it's going to be temporary, right? Like there's a sense like, oh, eventually mom will take over full time after we help just initially. And I wonder if that puts more pressure on moms who are experiencing postpartum, like where they feel like they're only going to get this help for right now, you know, like there's a sense of like, it's timed.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I know in Persian culture, there is like historically this, like the first 40 days, there is a lot of help, like meals are prepared. And in the past, like a woman would move back in with her parents and have like help, like she just would physically be at home with her parents and her baby having help. I also, what I've wondered sometimes is that with all of that help that comes, right? It's like someone cooking you meals and taking care of you. That all feels great. But I wonder, like, is it enough to have that, but not have a space to process the emotional piece of it? You know, like the physical help is great. It was great after I had my kids, and to have my mom come over and bring us meals, or my aunts or my sister to come over and just hold the baby so I could shower. That was all great. But I think that, again, like going back to this idea of stigma, there is so much stigma around, I think, just asking somebody if they're okay, like asking a new mom if they're okay, and then what to do with what to do if they say that they're not okay.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me, because I'm thinking back to, I had a client in my traineeship years when I was a tiny infant therapist. And of course, actually, this was one of my very first cases. She admitted to me, and she actually shared that it was her first time actually openly telling someone that she didn't have the words or the language to put to, postpartum depression. And luckily, like, I obviously at that time had been learning about stuff like that. But even I, not being a physical mother, I even was like, oh my gosh, what she's describing all of these different things. What does it mean? And the language that she would use, like, I feel so guilty to admit this, even to you, but I can't tell anyone about it because I'm supposed to be like this,
Yeah.
And I put myself in her shoes, and I was thinking, I don't know how do you navigate that? How do you sit with your own thoughts and think, like, my 1 minute, for her experience was like, 1 minute I wanted nothing but to protect my child, and then the next minute I wanted nothing to do with my child. It was a very serious thing, and I just couldn't even imagine. And at the end of that experience, I remember thinking, like, wow, someone like me who's not even in a position to feel like I can help her, that emotional support meant so much to her that even when she had her second child, she called me the next day about therapy. And I was like, you're in the hospital. You need to, you know what I mean? You just take care of yourself. I'm here for you, but you need to just, sleep and eat some food, drink some water. But it was amazing. I think it does all these small things. They go so unnoticed. And
sometimes all it takes is someone just holding the space to hear you, you know? That's it, just to hear what your experience is and to say that that's okay.
Yeah.
Yes. What is the frequency, Sahar, like how many women might experience this?
So current research shows around 15% of women experience significant depression after childbirth, but that doesn't include like other perinatal anxiety disorders. So the prevalence of postpartum anxiety is just as, if not higher than postpartum depression. And then we have the less common perinatal mood and anxiety disorders like postpartum OCD, postpartum PTSD, postpartum psychosis that are a small percentage too. So, I mean, it's a significant amount. That being said, there is like a mood disturbance that happens. We call it baby blues after you give birth that around 80% of women experience.
Oh.
Yeah. And it's transient. It only lasts about up to 2 weeks at most, I think. But that's a huge number. So 80% of women are experiencing like a significant mood disturbance within the first 2 weeks after giving birth, and they're not finding support. And so even though it's fleeting, even though it goes away, that's really scary as a first-time mom to be like, why am I crying all of the time? And I have this newborn baby that needs so much from me, and I can't make sense of how I'm feeling right now. I mean, this is what I hear from a lot of my clients. It's like, when will this end? Am I always going to feel this way? And to just be able to have that conversation of, it's going to be okay. You know, your body is cycling through this physical recovery and emotional recovery. I like the little anecdote or joke I like to give is that I felt like in my first month after giving birth that I cycled through 9 months of emotions in 4 weeks.
Wow.
You know, it just felt so wild and so fast because I went from like growing a baby inside of me for 9 months to now that baby's out, and I had all these feelings about it, and my body was recovering from giving birth, and it was a lot. And I didn't have, and I've been doing this work. I've been sitting with mothers since the very first client that I ever saw. So I've been doing this work for almost a decade, and I still like felt completely unprepared for the emotional aspect of this after having my own kids.
Wow.
Wow.
I feel like we should also just mention, because you're a licensed marriage and family therapist, but you're also working on your dissertation on this topic, right?
Yes.
Yes. So this is very like, this is another baby, your third baby that you're birthing.
Third baby. I'm not having any more biological children.
There you go. Oh my goodness. Wow. Melanie, did you have any more questions that you were going to ask?
Yeah. So kind of when we were talking a little bit about the family support and everything, I was curious, how are partners and family members impacted by postpartum when they're, you know, the mother's going through that?
Yeah, I love this question so much. So 9 to 10% of dads also experience postpartum depression. And I think that's really important to note that this is not a gender specific diagnosis. And it is also experienced, but it can be experienced by a male. And so this is important to note, like when working with same-sex couples who it can happen in adoption, it can happen in fostering. This experience of postpartum depression doesn't necessarily have to be connected to a biological birth. And so it's a lot. Oftentimes when we see mothers or one partner experiencing postpartum depression, when we look to also are having a similar experience. So I think it can be really, really challenging on a couple relationship when perinatal mood and anxiety disorders are present, because that stigma is extended, right? And so in the same way that the mother might not feel comfortable talking about it, a partner also maybe doesn't feel comfortable addressing it when they see something's going on. And so it almost becomes like this third party within the relationship that is always there, but no one wants to talk about. And so it's really tough. And it's a conversation that most couples don't have before they have a baby of like, okay, so how do we prepare ourselves? Like if this becomes something that we have to work through together, right? Because you're busy talking about what your nursery is going to look like and what baby names you're picking and, you know, all this other stuff that feels really, really important. But in the grand scheme of things, you know, there are other things that we can also focus on. So yeah, it becomes a big, big issue, because I think that there is, for a partner who is trying to support someone who is experiencing postpartum depression, but doesn't have the tools to talk to them about it.
Right. And
it's really isolating. And so go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say it reinforces that idea of like not creating language around it. Right. So what do you grab?
Yeah. Yes.
Wow.
Right. So it's like that isolation that a mother may feel, like her partner may also be feeling that same isolation.
I'm wondering too, and I just want to create space for this too, is what's coming up for me is folks who are intersex and folks who are trans, you know, what this experience, how this is experienced through that lens, you know, through that lived experience of your gender identity and also giving birth, and what that might add on top of other things that you may already be experiencing, and all of those narratives that you already have stigma surrounding, you know?
Yeah. So the research around postpartum, like perinatal mood and anxiety disorders in diverse populations is extremely limited. And I think that one of the areas that it's the most limited is in like what the trans experience is like. I know that a lot of it, I went to a conference last summer on like, it was through Postpartum Support International. And the last keynote speaker that they had was a trans man who had experienced pregnancy and birth. And listening to his experience on what that was like for him and how he had to advocate for himself in his own experience was incredibly moving. And so the things that really stuck out to me were things like language and really talking to people and listening to what their language is. The language that I use about my experience of birth and pregnancy and postpartum is going to look different than the language that a trans person uses and their experience of the same thing. And so I think that that becomes a big piece of the communication around perinatal mood and anxiety disorders and pregnancy as a whole, is identifying the language that people use to explore and communicate what their experience is.
Wow. And I'm thinking too, for populations who, or, you know, diverse marginalized groups who are constantly oppressed, I'm wondering how this experience can also just reinforce how they're already feeling outside of this like phase for them. You know, like,
I mean, do we have like 3 hours to talk about
this? I know.
I mean, looking at diverse populations and anything birth related, that when you look at the health disparity, it is mind blowing. And when you look at the oppression and the trauma around birthing for Black and brown women, it's hard. And I feel like that's not even doing it justice. Right. When you read about things like eugenics, you read about the Jim Crow era and how something like breastfeeding was a beautiful part of my journey into motherhood. And it was something that made me feel really connected to my kids. And I genuinely enjoyed doing it. And then when you read studies and research around why there is so much stigma around like breastfeeding for Black women, and you're like, wow, I hadn't even considered that because I have the privilege of not even having to understand that, because that wasn't a part of my lived experience. And so when we look at the context of the generational traumas and experiences of people of color, of Black people, of, you know, any marginalized, diverse community, and we look at the context of their lived experiences, we have to move into a space in our care, in our mental health care, and in our, you know, medical care that takes into account what people have been through and what they're coming in the door with. You know, and that it's impactful to what their experience is, especially in motherhood. You know, medical trauma is a real thing, and medical trauma is a thing that people of color, Latinx, and Black folks, African-American folks have experienced for centuries. Wow. It impacts their mental health. It impacts the way that they experience, you know, what's supposed to be, quote unquote, supposed to be this beautiful, joyful time. Like there's generations, centuries of trauma around that for them.
Yes. And that, I mean, I know for a lot of the Latin community, I mean, first of all, we don't even have access to resources. And when we do have access to those resources, they're subpar, to say the least.
Right.
Because of that, many people don't even try to access those because they're just like, well, what's the point? So a lot of hope, I feel like there's a lot of hopelessness sometimes around accessing medical care for a lot of
that's so important to note in this conversation, because if there is hopelessness going into the situation, and hopelessness is a marker of postpartum depression, that's important to note. You know, is that part of the reason why we see higher rates of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders in people of color? Maybe. You know?
Yeah. And if you're like, from my family's perspective, there's so much shame around, like, we don't go to the doctor. That's just not
right.
And if you go to the doctor, it's because you're literally about to take your last breath, you know? So it's already, wow, that's just, when you were talking about the breastfeeding too, I was thinking it's amazing that it's such a magical moment. So that's the narrative that we're kind of like, we pass around, and it is an actual lived experience. But then there's this other side of, they have, I don't know if you've heard, I'm sure you have, in Brazil, they have these breastfeeding banks because of, so they've created this like underground, and not just Brazil, but like it's all around, but it's difficult to find in the States. But there are breastfeeding banks where people will sell their breast milk and
so they have this in the United States. It's just not, it's not legal to sell your breast milk. So this might be too much information, but we'll just go there. So I donated like 2,000 ounces of my own breast milk when I was nursing because I had an oversupply. And there's a Facebook group. It's called Human Milk for Human Babies. And women post on there, like, I donated to a woman who had thyroid cancer and was unable to breastfeed her babies. So I donated my milk to her. So this is a thing. So when we talk about like, it takes a village, quote unquote, like this is what we're talking about. These are the hard parts of motherhood that people don't often talk about. I didn't know what to do with the 2,000 ounces of breast milk that I had in my freezer that was going to go bad until someone told me, like, there's a Facebook group that you can go on. You can't sell it. You legally can't sell it in the state of California, but you can donate it.
Oh my gosh.
And so I was able to do that,
And
so I think that there are these, but no one told me that. You're welcome. My OB didn't tell me that. Like, no one had told me that that was an option of something that I could do. And so part of the anxiety that I experienced was like, oh my God, I have all this milk so bad. I wasted all of this milk that my baby doesn't even need. And you like get into that pattern of, should I have just spent more time with my baby instead of spending 40 minutes pumping that last time, or, whatever it is. And you get into this spiral of thoughts. Wow. Where like, there's like, no, you did it. And now you can help somebody else out. And that feels great. Like, it feels great to be in community with other moms.
Right. Wow. I mean, I've never heard of that actually before. So I'm learning a lot of new things in this conversation.
I feel so excited that of all people to be diving into this and connecting the dots in the literature. Like, Sahar, I'm so excited that it's you. Because of how even the way you're expressing yourself, like with the passion and the emotion behind it, we need people that feel that way, we need people that are close to this so they know how important it is and really take it somewhere. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So what are just kind of thinking, what are the best ways to like support people in our lives who might be going through this? Kind of, I know we talked about a few things, but just kind of narrowing the list a little bit.
Yeah. So I think that, if you have friends or clients, we'll start with friends. If you have friends or family that are having babies, check in on them, and I think a lot of times new moms will default to like, oh, I'm great, the baby's this way. Check in on them again. But how are you doing? Are you getting any sleep? Are you feeling rested? Are you, you know what I mean? Just ask questions, be a friend. You don't need to be a therapist for your friends or family, but you can be present for them. You can ask, do you feel, I know that sometimes postpartum depression is a thing that happens for moms. Do you think that's something that you're experiencing? And just dive into it. I wish that someone had asked me that, had asked like how I was actually feeling and had kind of called me out when I would try to avoid the question. I think from a therapeutic standpoint, when we're assessing, so there's like, there's assessment tools that are peer reviewed and they're great. They're effective, like the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale. They've been using it forever and it's great. But if we're giving it to someone without any context, it's really easy for someone to just check off the boxes and go, it's a self-reported scale. I got it when I was like 5 days postpartum at my first pediatrician visit with my kids. No one talked to me about it. No one asked me how I was doing. They just handed me with a bunch of other papers like, oh, just fill this out before you leave. I'm a therapist. I know what to write on that, And so I think from a provider perspective, it's all about language and having that conversation, So yeah, fill this out, but like, let's just take a few minutes and check in. How are you doing? How are you sleeping? Are you experiencing any of these feelings? Are you feeling overwhelmed? Sometimes overwhelm looks like this. My postpartum depression, like I never felt disconnected from my baby. That's not what postpartum depression looked like for me. But every night after my kids would go to sleep, I would just sit in my bedroom and cry for hours. And I kept trying to find reasons for my sadness. And for a while it was like, I want another kid, even though I never wanted more than 2 kids. And it took months to get to a place where I was like, oh no, I'm feeling depressed. I'm depressed and anxious all the time. And this is what this is. It's postpartum depression. It's not that I'm trying to find a reason for my sadness, and the reason for my sadness is postpartum. So I think as providers, we really need to listen to people, and we need to hear what their stories are. And we need to understand that even though we have this set of criteria that postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety is supposed to look like, it might look different for other people, and to explore what that looks like for them.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, out of all the work that you've done in your practice with the people who you meet with, maybe experiencing these things, what has stood out to you the most? Just in terms of course, we know now a little bit more about the diagnosis and the symptoms, but what stands out to you the most, having personally experienced this and then in your clients?
I think the feelings of isolation. Well, if we're going to talk about like a lived experience, I think that the consistent thing that I hear across culture, across socioeconomic status, across, experience, like whether you're a single mom, a couple, whatever it is this feeling of isolation that is consistent. That like I am the only person that's experiencing this, and it's like, I guess it's both isolation and hopelessness, and I don't know that I will never not feel this way. And so I think that there is so much beauty that you experience in entering parenthood. And with that beauty, there is also a lot of loss. And if we don't address both of those experiences, it's the both and, right? Like these things coexist together. You're stepping into this new season of your life, and you also kind of might have to grieve the loss of what you're leaving behind and stepping forward into this. And sometimes those feelings of loss are really overwhelming for a lot of people.
Do you talk about resiliency with your clients? Because I feel like that's such a big factor here.
I do talk about resiliency. And in talking about resiliency, I feel like that comes a little bit later in this work, because I think that there is so much need for validation of the present experience. So I think in what I have seen in my clients and what I have experienced personally is that there is so much of this mindset that's like moms are superheroes and they can do anything and everything, right? And it's what everyone tells you. Like, I don't know how you do it all. I hear this a lot. Like, you work, you have 2 kids. How do you do it all? And I'm like, I mean, I don't do any of it well, but I do it. Like, and so I think that the narrative of resiliency is really, really, really loud for a lot of people. So I think that conversation comes a little bit later. And in the clinical work that I do, a lot of it is in validating what the experience of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders is for the client sitting there. Yeah. And so
meeting them where they're at, kind of,
absolutely.
And just being with them.
Yeah. And so once that happens, once we can say, okay, so this is what's going on, here are what some of your options are, then it's almost like that conversation of resiliency naturally happens, right? And so as we start to unpack and process what the experience is, and we can start talking about like, you survived the day. And how amazing is that? Or like, today you had a great day. Yesterday was really hard, but today you had a great day. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how that impacts tomorrow and how that maybe puts some context to yesterday. So I feel like that conversation of resiliency is always there, but to access it in a way that doesn't feel dismissive to the client is really important.
Right. Yeah.
So it's almost like the resiliency is you just managing all those things instead of being this like big superhero, the superhero is in you, man. Yeah. Okay. So
if I had you have, okay, I'm gonna let you go.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So my last thing, and it was really important to me, is since you identify as someone having experienced this, what has been the most healing for you in your endeavors of understanding all of this?
That's such a good question.
Thank you. It took me a while.
So but you got there. So I think in my clinical work, what has been the most healing is to be someone for my clients that I didn't have. And so it's almost like reparenting myself, but not my inner child stuff, like reparenting my mother, like my own motherness, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So remothering myself, I don't know, but just like being this person for other people that I really needed in my own experience and didn't have. In my research, I mean, my research is tough. I cry a lot reading my research, to be really transparent. It's hard to read about like the ongoing oppression and trauma that women experience, that women of color are experiencing even today. And so that's the hard part of it. The part that feels really good is that my husband said this thing to me the other night, and I've been thinking about it. I was up late working on my dissertation, and he's like, I had a thought, like there's going to be a time when someone's going to be working on their dissertation and they're going to be reading your dissertation to cite their work. And that is really cool, that like you're going to have this ongoing impact in this space that you feel really passionately about. And I was like, damn, he's right. Like, and that does feel really good. Like that feels really good. And
well, so that's your legacy, right? That's your baby.
That's, yeah, and so I think on all the work that we're doing, we read these dissertation topics because there's things that we feel passionately about. And I think that there was this fear for me that like, once this dissertation is done, once I'm done doing this research, like, does it just go away and that's it? Like, then this thing I've worked for so long is just completed and, done. And he said that, and I was like, oh no, it's like a living thing. It's ongoing. And that felt really nice.
Wow. Let's just snaps for Mr. Martinez. Oh my gosh. Like coming through with this support.
John Martinez.
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's powerful, because that's just simply holding space for you and reflecting. He's reflecting your greatness back to you,
Yeah, he's a good one.
Amazing. Well, this has been honestly incredible. I am very grateful for this time. Oh my goodness.
I'm grateful to you guys. Thank you so much. This was so nice.
And I hope that we get to see how this unfolds further when you do the rest of it, and as your baby grows.
I'm ready to birth this baby, guys.
Yeah.
For a long time.
Yeah, just for those that listen to our little podcast, we're all three in the same stage of birthing this thing called dissertation.
I'm going to say you guys are ahead of me in this.
I'm defending this semester.
Yeah, so you're definitely ahead, and you've already proposed, Chelze.
Yeah, but
let's not underplay what anyone's doing.
Okay, but you've been working really hard. I see you. You're climbing up there.
We're all working hard, but like, let's give credit where credit is due.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'm very excited.
We'll all walk together in May.
Oh yes, crossing my fingers for that. Oh my goodness. Thank you everyone for who's been tuning in and for sharing space with us today. I hope that you found this conversation in some way helpful and inspiring, and that you continue to kind of dive into whatever it is that speaks to you. And yeah, we will be back for another episode next time. And thank you again for sharing space, everyone, today. And we'll see you next time. Ciao.
Having you